Hey gaming fans, so today's just another discussion video. I'm going to be talking about some Yu-Gi-Oh cards that allow you to see your opponent's hand. You're probably wondering what the point of that is, unless you've, done this strategy before, but obviously there are two things in Yu-Gi-Oh that are not really supposed to be knowledge of the other player, and one is the deck, what's inside the deck, and the other one is what's on inside their hand. So why would you want to look at your opponent's hand? Well, that's pretty obvious. You want to know what your opponent's going to play, what kind of monsters they're going to throw at you, what kind of spells and traps they're going to set. And that might be handy for things like hand traps. Now this is, obviously these cards are probably more suited for the GOAT format, which is what I was going to originally make this video on. But I think this would apply to also if you play regular Yu-Gi-Oh! But cards like, in GOAT format, they don't have hand traps, but in regular Yu-Gi-Oh! They do. Well, aside from cards like, Kuriboh, which hardly anybody plays, there's not really a whole lot of stuff in your opponent's hand. However, you can play cards like Mind Crush and DD Designator. Both these cards will rip a card out of your opponent's hand. And it's not random, which is the best part of this, because there's a lot of cards that, like Don Zalug, for instance, that will randomly discard from your opponent's hand, but sometimes it's better to actually target your opponent's hand, kind of like Smoke Grenade of the Thief, the equip card, but that requires a little bit of, more of a setup. You have to actually destroy the card. Whereas these cards, you just got to know what's in your opponent's hand. So DD Designator is you declare one card name, look at your opponent's hand, and if they have the declared card, they remove it from play. If they don't have it, you remove one random card from your hand from play. So strategically, you want to make sure you know what's in your opponent's hand. But you could also use the opposite reaction to your advantage in that you might want to banish a card from your hand. Same with Mind Crush. You declare a card name. If it's in your opponent's hand, they must discard it and all copies. And if it's not, you discard one card at random from your hand. This was commonly used in decks like Dark World, for instance, where if it backfired on you, you might be able to discard one of your Dark World monsters and special summon it to the field. Or you might use it with zombies, because oftentimes in zombie decks, you want your monsters in the graveyard. Sometimes you might even call it wrong just to get the discard effect. Call a card that you know for sure they don't have in their hand, like, say, Kuriboh or Exodia the Forbidden One, if they're not playing an Exodia deck. So what are some ways to look at your opponent's hand? Well, there's a few options here. So I grabbed a couple. We got a few monsters that do it. Ceremonial Bell is one. The problem with Ceremonial Bell is it's weak. It's the weakest of all kind of weaknesses. 0 attack. As long as this card remains face up on the field, you and your opponent must show your respective hands to each other. So the downside to this, obviously, is your opponent also gets to look at your hand, but that's okay. You're probably going to set up for that. The 1850 defense is your only saving grace with this card, but you do have to get some way to get it into defense mode. Obviously, you can set the card and hope your opponent rams into it with something smaller than 1850. But, you got to worry about Nobleman of Frostout. You got to worry about anything that just destroys a card while it's face up on the field, or while it's face down on the field, I should say. So you gotta really work with this card. The advantage is, once you play this card, you're going to know what's in their hand, so even if they do run over it, who cares? You've got the advantage out of the card. Now, there is a monster that's a slightly bigger monster called Mind on Air, which is not really good, actually. As long as this card remains face up on the field, your opponent must continue to show their hand. Better effect because it's only your opponent. Problem is it's a tribute monster, so it's a level 6 spellcaster with 1000 attack and 1600 defense. Now you can sneak this card into play with, say, Mystic Tomato, ram your Mystic Tomato into one of their big monsters, pull this sucker out, now you got access to their hand. Unfortunately, its defense is weak, so turning it to defense mode isn't really going to do much for it. 16 is okay in GOAT format anyways, because, most of the time monsters are a little bit smaller than that. If a breaker used his counter already, he's 1600, so we can't ram over this guy. But in most cases, 16 is just really weak. It's too bad they didn't make this guy like a 2400, or even his defense being 2400 would have really made this card a lot better. But unfortunately, it's just not that good. Other ways we could look at our opponent's hand, or not really look at the hand, but know what's in your opponent's hand, is to bounce monsters back. Compulsory evacuation device, monsters like Wall of Illusion, which if they run into it, the card gets bounced back to their hand. And then you could be ready with your Mind Crush. The good thing about Mind Crush is once that happens, you get to look at their hand and verify what's in their hand to make sure that they're discarding all copies of that card. So, once you bounce a card back to your hand, you could use this as a way to look at their hand. Then there's other more obscure cards like Convulsion of Nature. Again, much like the Ceremonial Bell, it affects both players. So you get to see what's always on the top of your deck, but you also get to see what's on the top of your opponent's deck. This card obviously has its little combo piece, Archfiend's Oath, where once per turn you get to pay 500 life points, declare a card name, draw the card, and if it's the one, you get to add it to your hand, otherwise you send it to the graveyard. So having that top deck information is valuable to this card, but it also gives you the same resources to play things like DD Designator if they don't play that card or set it, or even better to have Mind Crush set when your opponent takes their turn, and then you know what to discard. You got to be careful though with quick plays and stuff like that, like MSTs and Scapegoats, because they can chain it, so you got to be careful with that. Then we have Trap Dust Chute. So this card is banned in regular Yu-Gi-Oh, but Goat format, you're able to play three of this one. Now this one's a little bit of a challenge because your opponent has to have 4 cards in their hand. So obviously a strategy like this is revolving around getting cards out of your opponent's hand, which could make this card troublesome, but on your opening turn, if you draw your Trap Dust Chute, it's perfect. Because once your opponent has 4 or more cards in their hand, you get to look at their hand, take one of their monsters, and shuffle it into the deck. Really good card. Lots of people play this card. It sees lots of tournament play. It's obviously a good card, but it can have its problems where mid to late game it might be useless. So you got to be careful with this one. Then we have cards that just straight up look at your opponent's hands. So this is an interesting one. This is pay 500 life points, look at your opponent's hand, and set cards on the field. So it's Mind Haxors. I'm not sure how that's actually pronounced. But this is an interesting one. It's not permanent, so you have to like activate it and then look at your opponent's hand in the field, and then you have to just remember what was in there because they get to hold their hand back and then you don't get to see it anymore. And then obviously next turn they're going to draw a card and you're not going to know what that new card is. Or if they have a card like say Reload and they shuffle their hand back into their deck, you've lost that. So I mean, this is okay. I like how it looks at the set cards on the field as well. It can kind of give you that information like, should I attack, should I not attack, is it going to be a flip effect monster, should I use my Nobleman of Crossout on it. I know in Goat format people are always worried about playing Nobleman and they're not going to hit say the Magician of Faith or the Gravekeeper Spy, but they're going to hit say something like Mystic Tomato. So this gives you that information you might need. If you want a more permanent one, there's Respect Play. Again, these are all pretty old cards. This is back to Pharaoh's Servant, I think like the 3rd set to come out in Yu-Gi-Oh! During their respective turns, each player must show their opponent's hand. So this is basically Ceremonial Bell's effect in a trap card, in a continuous trap card. So obviously it's prone to things like Mystical Space Typhoon. If they were to chain to it, you're not going to see their hand, but also they get to see your hand. So there is some disadvantages to it. And of course the card in itself, just like Mind Haxors, is a -1 in card advantage. Because they don't do anything else. They just let you look at their hand. However, that knowledge could be pretty powerful and allow for some pretty disruptive plays, especially if you could wipe out your opponent's hand of all their valuable cards. And then there's one left, and that's the Eye of Truth. Much like Respect Play, it's a continuous trap card, also from Pharaoh's Servant. As long as this card remains face up on the field, your opponent must show their hand. So this is a good one in that only your opponent is showing their hand. The problem is your opponent increases their life points for 1,000 life points each standby phase if he controls a magic card, which has been renamed a spell card, in their hand. So as long as they have a spell card in their hand during their standby phase, they're getting 1,000 life points. There could be some combos to that. Bad reaction to Smochi, or whatever it's called, where every time your opponent gains life, they take damage instead. The thing is, though, if that was the case, they would probably just set the spell cards and not have to take the damage. So then you'd have to deal with the spell cards being set on the field. But because you know what they are, you know if you should destroy them or not. If you've got your breaker in your hand, if they set a Pot of Greed or whatever, why they would do that, I don't know. But you can go and breaker that card anyways. Maybe it's a Heavy Storm or something that they plan to use later. But yeah, these are all just interesting choices that I pulled out. You know, I was thinking about what kind of a deck would work with this. There's lots of options out there. Lots of different kinds of decks. Obviously, just discarding cards out of your hand is not going to be, you know, groundbreaking as far as winning you a duel, because you still have to do something else. You still have to be able to attack, or you know, just simply wiping out their hand isn't going to do anything. Eventually they're going to catch up. Eventually they're going to get monsters on the field and start attacking you. So there's got to be a good strategy where you could use this. You know, maybe some people were using like Warriors with Gearfried, the Iron Knight, and the Smoke Grenade of the Thief. You know, things like that, just so you still have an engine where you're able to attack your opponent. But I just wanted to talk about these cards and see what you have to say. Anyways, let me know what you think. If there's some cards that I missed, throw them in the chats. I know I talk mostly about GOAT right now, GOAT format, but you know, even in regular format, these cards most of them are legal anyways, and you can still pull these off. Anyways, hope you liked the video. Throw some comments down below. Hope you subscribe. Talk to you later.